Welcome to the Drydock, everybody. This was recorded before the Patreon version, so hopefully this should be the last episode of the Drydock where I sound all stuffed up and horrible. Anyway, but in more cheerful news, Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, what is my take on the wisdom of the Imperial Japanese Navy's conversions, transforming Megami, Issei, Hyuga, and Shinano into aircraft carriers or pseudo-aircraft carriers? Well, all urges to make a Linux programming joke aside, the question goes on to elaborate about would they have been better off expediting the Amagi class carriers. The simple fact of the matter is, with the situation that the Japanese had, the ships didn't have battleship guns, so the biggest long lead item was gone from the equation when it comes to normal warships. But the other big long lead items are things like machinery, and yes, an Amagi class carrier would have been a fairly useful bit of kit, assuming they had any aircraft or pilots to use on them at that point, in terms of trained naval aviators, which they were somewhat lacking. But if they had tried to continue building them, they would have had to manufacture new sets of machinery, as well as entirely new hulls. And I don't think the Japanese industry at that point was really in a position to be able to do that, whereas converting existing ships, the bulk of the hull was already there, the engines and machinery were already there, the amount of work put into making, especially the half carriers. I mean, Shinano was a separate issue, but the half, the hybrid carriers like Megami and Issei, etc., they actually took up a surprisingly small amount of resources in exchange for a ship that could fly off a bunch of fighters and such. But as I've said before, when we've discussed these ships in other similar but related questions, they are symptomatic of a problem. And yes, you can make them work, and yes, you can make an argument for them being somewhat useful, but in so doing, you're admitting you're in a situation where you have much larger problems. Basically, the short form, as I see it, is that for something like an Issei, you could make an argument that as a fleet escort, they could be made fairly useful because they still have a significant anti-shipping anti-surface battery that they can use against attackers who are coming into trying to attack a carrier air group, and you can still equip them with tons of anti-aircraft guns, which are always useful as escort, and you can make the best use of the limited flight space by using your smallest aircraft, which are fighters, so basically make it a dedicated fighter carrier, which then means you can either have a stronger fighter wing compared to what you would just have with your carriers, or you can maybe dedicate the fighters on your various hybrids to fleet defense, and then use all the fighters and strike aircraft on your fleet carriers for strike and strike escort, which probably then means that you can have either a stronger escort or a bigger strike package. So there is a certain amount of sense, at least on a surface level, that makes. The problem is that if you are in a position where you are trying to make hybrid battleship carriers or hybrid cruiser carriers, the only reason you'd be trying to do that is if you can't build more carriers yourself, and the only reason you have to build more carriers is if your enemy has more carriers, and if you're in a position where your enemy has a lot more carriers than you, to the point that you're so desperate for carrier hulls you're converting your existing surface combatants, you've probably lost the war anyway, and doing this is only going to stave off the inevitable. So, and that pretty much is what happened, albeit not so much with the staving and more so much with the inevitable part. Bushy from Oz asks, what were the politics behind the Royal Australian Navy being forced to decommission its flagship HMAS Australia, the Indefatigable class battlecruiser paid for by the Australian government, so that the Royal Navy could meet the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty? So, unfortunately, we have to get political. Fortunately, it's colonial-imperial era politics, so I think everyone involved in that particular argument is dead now. Anyway, the issue was that weirdly enough, it was entirely possible for Australia to have retained HMAS Australia and for a bunch of other navies, small navies, to have retained a lot more ships. Now, before we go any further, this doesn't include HMS New Zealand, and it doesn't include New Zealand because although the New Zealand government did buy a number of warships, HMS New Zealand was bought as a gift to Britain, and the official Royal New Zealand Navy didn't actually form until the Second World War. Up to that, it had been known as the New Zealand Squadron of the Royal Navy, so it was still technically a British control. That's why at the Battle of the River Plate, it's technically actually HMS Ajax and HMS Achilles, not HMNZS for one of them. But anyway, the three larger dominions, which would be South Africa, Canada, and Australia. And yes, there are a bunch of legal technicalities around Australia being slightly different to South Africa and Canada in that respect. But anyway, Dominion is a good shorthand for their legal status, which was basically they had pretty much near enough full internal autonomy, but certain matters like foreign policy and defence were reserved for Britain to make until the Balfour Declaration of the mid-1920s and the Statute of Westminster of 1931. But anyway, that's getting a bit off topic. The basic point was that those three nations all had their own recognised separate navies or naval services, including the Royal Australian Navy, which is the main point of the question. And those naval services were perfectly entitled, if they so wanted to retain and maintain their own ships, completely separate from the Royal Navy. So it would have been HMCS, HMAS, HMSAS, etc. And that would have been completely different to the Royal Navy's allocated tonnages, amounts, and limits under the Washington Naval Treaty, had those governments chosen to send their own representatives to the Washington Naval Conference. However, the various powers, including Australia, decided that they would let Britain do all the talking for them, and Britain would basically speak collectively for them. So any agreement that Britain entered into, the UK entered into as the formal head of the British Empire, would apply equally across the board. And hence, this is why HMAS Australia had to be sunk, because it was technically classed as a capital ship and needed to be gotten rid of to bring Britain's numbers, the Royal Navy's numbers down, even though technically it wasn't a Royal Navy ship. So if that sounds confusing enough for you, it gets better. So technically, as I said, if the Australians had decided they wanted to send their own people there, they could have argued, no, the Royal Australian Navy is a completely separate service, we get our own limits. Yes, we'll stick to the treaty limits, but we maintain the right to maintain our own capital ships, and that's separate to any co-equal agreement that you get with Britain. There's also an argument to be made where you could say, well, actually, HMS Australia in the 1920s probably doesn't count as a capital ship, because the definition of a capital ship in the Washington Naval Treaty is a ship that can stand in the line of battle, and considering that the line of battle at that period is consisting of ships with 14, 15 and 16-inch guns and double-digit thicknesses of armour plate, an indefatigable class battle cruiser you'd be very hard-pressed to argue could stand in the line of battle. And since all the definitions for cruisers were for ships built after the treaty signing date, you could make a fairly plausible argument to define the HMAS Australia as a relatively large armoured cruiser, which would technically be reverting it back to its original designation, and so you could keep it anyway, even regardless of capital ship limits. Yeah, so go figure. The reason that Australia and Canada and South Africa didn't go for these options of effectively negotiating their own niche under the Navy, under the Washington Naval Treaty, were twofold. One was that the economic recession that would briefly go away and then be replaced with the Great Depression was affecting all countries, and kind of if you allowed a treaty to officially say you have to get rid of X, Y, Z ships, it gave the governments an easy way to cut defence spending quite significantly. Um, and also, bizarrely enough, having spent the better part of 2 centuries being very sly, sneaky, and underhanded in managing to take over a quarter of the planet, the British Empire, for some reason, had suddenly decided it wanted to play scrupulously fair and kind of internally acknowledged that something that the other nations may or may not have pressed, which was the fact that, at least at the time, being dominions, foreign policy and defence was still to a certain degree mandated from Westminster, which meant that in the event of war, the Royal Navy could call upon the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal South African Naval Service, and the Royal Canadian Navy to back it up. So, if those various nations had insisted on keeping their own navies on the same kind of acknowledgement levels as like France and Italy, then they could have maintained their own capital ships and everything, but there's a reasonable possibility that America and Japan would have gone, well, hang on a minute, we can't agree to Britain being equal in fleet size to America because if all these other three dominions also have their own fleets, then that means the instant you go to war, you're just going to call on them, and then you're going to have a bigger fleet than everyone else, which is kind of deliberately going around the whole point of this treaty. So we won't agree to it. But at the same time, they might not have caused a lot of issues and fuss, but the British apparently, as I say, were on a very bizarre and uncharacteristic fairness streak and thought, oh no, it's only fair, we must be honest and equal with everybody. I know, even as a British person, this sounds very unnatural for the British Empire or for British government generally, but there you go. That's what they were thinking. Um, so yeah, it was a combination of political expediency in the colonies and a strange streak of honesty in the British politicians that meant they collectively added up what you could effectively call the British Imperial Forces and negotiated from a collective position, which ended up with the Royal Navy cut down to the size that it was cut down to the Washington Naval Treaty, and that meant Australia had to go, unfortunately for the Australians. It is always a slightly weird one to consider that theoretically you could have had a situation where Canada and Australia, at least, maybe not South Africa because they didn't have too much money at the time, but Canada and Australia at least could have had a small capital ship formation. Certainly something at least on a par with, say, the Kriegsmarine. That might have changed the face of World War II quite significantly if the declaration of war had suddenly found the Royal Navy pretty much doubling in size because all the various Commonwealth navies just showed up to join in the fun. But, well, could have, would have, didn't. Hopefully that's slightly cleared up the situation. And, wow, the answer to that question took a while. Anyway, next question. Brian Fields asks, the Warspites' new tower-style superstructure and bridge structure look almost identical to the design of Rodney and Howe. Is there an... I think you mean Rodney and Nelson, but anyway. Is there... I suppose maybe Rodney King George V as well. But, off topic. Get back on topic track. Stop it. Is there a name for that design-style or a backstory to its unique streamlined office building look? So, yes, there is a backstory to it. They, well, in terms of a name, design style, they're basically just called tower or block superstructures, not particularly imaginative. Quite a lot of Royal Navy officers had their own nickname for it. They called them Queen Anne's mansions after, well, the mansions built by Queen Anne, whose structural style actually bears a noticeable resemblance to the superstructures, bizarrely enough. So there you go. In terms of backstory, basically, as in common with practically every other navy up until that point, running up to and through the First World War, the British had built their capital ships with these lovely, big, heavily armoured conning towers, which the command staff was supposed to go into in the event of battle so that they could be protected against incoming shell fire. However, Royal Navy officers almost to a man had shown a distinct lack of willingness to go into the conning tower, and there were some reasonable tactical reasons for doing so. The main one being you basically couldn't see anything, but also I think it just offended their sense of martial pride. And the fact that direct hits on conning towers tended to kill everyone inside anyway, even if the armour wasn't breached. So at that point, it's like, well, might as well be higher up, out of the way of most of the shells, and then at least you can see stuff, and they might be less likely to hit you because you'll have commanded your ship better. But anyway, the long and the short of it was that they realised when they were building the Nelson class, which was the first one to have these big Queen Anne's Mansion style superstructures, that Royal Navy officers weren't going to go in your conning tower whatever you did, so they just started cutting down on the size of the conning tower, and later on some ships just taking it out completely. So it, yeah, the conning tower just got smaller and smaller. They left it in there just in case, but by the time we got to the King George V, it was pretty small, pathetic, and basically unarmoured anyway, almost. But so with that spare weight and a little bit more spare real estate, the British designers effectively went, well, if they're going to stay up there, we might as well blast them and make them comfortable, and started sticking a whole bunch of extra bits and pieces up there because it turned out it was a nice storage area for lightweight stuff. Additionally, there had been some appreciation that fire control systems were getting heavier and more complex, and there was a need for spotting platforms and extra fire control directors for secondary batteries and anti-aircraft batteries and all this kind of stuff. So the British designers went, well, just build a big block that they could all go on and call it a day. And that turned out actually to be a very good thing because the tower-style superstructure could support an awful lot of weight and it was very stable. So you could have all the fire control directors and radars, and later on, obviously, not in the 1920s, but later on, radars and staff and fire control computers, all sorts of fancy bits and pieces. And they were all held up fairly stably, fairly nicely, very little, if any, vibration, and it all worked out pretty well for them, and that's why Warspite got its tower superstructure as part of its rebuild, because that seemed to be the best way ahead. It was a bit of a fortuitous decision, because, as I say, all the extra bits and pieces you had to add over the Second World War, a lot of ships that had been built with more conservative superstructure styles, especially in other navies, actually did suffer significantly from having to cut back on stuff or upgrade the strength of other things. There were other ways of going about this. I mean, the Japanese famously took one look at all this extra equipment and just went, I know, we'll put a platform for everything. One platform for one new thing, and very rapidly came up with the pagoda mast, which was just sort of like infinite Lego platforms surrounding a tripod mast. So there you go. So yeah, that's the backstory to the wonderful world of Royal Navy interwar and World War II battleship tower superstructures. It was an acknowledgement of the fact that Royal Navy officers would insist on staying up and fighting regardless of the fact that there were shells flying everywhere, so might as well make the best of it. Sir Jim asks, why did basically everybody persist in having secondary battleship armament in casemates going through into the 1920s and so on, given that they had the examples of the Lord Nelsons and other such pre-dreadnoughts having their secondary batteries in turrets much earlier? Well, part of the answer is that casemates weigh less than turrets, so you can get more guns for the same displacement. And secondly, they affect the ship's stability less because not only do they weigh less, but you can put them lower down in the ship, whereas obviously with turrets you have to tend to put them on the main deck for obvious reasons. So when you're trying to build a big secondary battery, people who were slightly obsessed with the sheer number of guns sort of went, oh, well, we'll just put lots and lots of them in casemates, and then that's easy and cheap and lightweight, and we still have lots of guns. So there's that aspect to it. Partly also is that you've got to remember that the pre-dreadnought armament that you saw in secondary batteries was the intermediate battery. The intermediate battery was what had gone away. A lot of pre-dreadnought battleships, we might call it primary, secondary, and tertiary. They called it primary, intermediate, and secondary. But basically, you get the idea. You had the main battery. You had a slightly lighter battery, but not by much, and then they had the general hail of fire weaponry, which was generally 3-4 inch, maybe 5 inch guns. And when the intermediate battery went away to be replaced with a bigger main battery, a lot of ships kept that what we would have then called the tertiary battery, kept that around for anti-destroyer work, and the tertiary battery had always been in casemates, so it kind of just it stayed on as a force of habit. Um, and it wasn't until you started having to look at other factors that you began to see those disappear. So as you mentioned in your question, you've got things like the Nelson class, which mounted all their secondary batteries in twin turrets, and this was basically an acknowledgement of the fact that, well, apart from the fact that the shorter superstructure meant you couldn't get as many casement-mounted guns in, um, it was also an acknowledgement of the fact that turrets gave you a wider arc and field of fire, so therefore you could actually get more effect out of fewer turret-mounted guns than you could out of more casement-mounted guns. Uh, but again, this also coincided with the development of sort of secondary rangefinders and such for the secondary batteries, which meant that the secondary batteries could actually engage at a useful range beyond point blank with any degree of accuracy. And we're on to the Discord questions. So, Roman Navy 27 has a three-part question. What were the roles and missions for coastal battleships, the use of river monitors in World War One and World War Two, and the Italian Navy submarine campaign in the Battle of the Atlantic in World War Two? So, in reverse order, Italian Navy submarine campaign in the Battle of the Atlantic in World War Two, not a tremendous amount. The Italians knew full well that most of their submarines were designed for the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is a much warmer, much shallower sea that doesn't require tremendous range. The Atlantic, you need a submarine to be able to keep itself and its crew warm. You need to go a lot further. You need to be a lot more stable, and yeah, you need to be able to dive a lot deeper, and all these other things. So the Italians, knowing that their submarines weren't really that suited for Atlantic operations, didn't get too involved. They did base a bunch of some subs out of Bordeaux in France, I guess to show willing. They did sink just over 100 Allied merchant ships, adding to about 500,000 tons of shipping, but compared to the main U-boat offensive, they were very much a secondary player, and the Italians had more than enough problems dealing with the Allied navies in the Mediterranean, so they tended to try and keep most of their submarines in the Mediterranean to try and help them and to attack Allied supply lines there, which they were much more suited to do. In terms of river monitors, not a tremendous amount happened in World War Two. There are a few of them used on the Russian front, but true river monitors as opposed to gunboats, not really. A couple of the minor nations like the Romanians had a few, but those that existed at the beginning of the war didn't tend to last very long because the front moved so quickly. Those that did tended to end up on coastal operational duties. The Russians did have a few rather heavy ones over in the Far East. They built a class of 3, but again, not tremendous amount of activity really. In World War One, again, outside of some Austro-Hungarian monitors they built for their own internal river policing service, most of the monitors that were involved were coastal and seagoing ships. So again, in terms of pure river monitors, not a tremendous amount was ever done. And finally, roles and missions for coastal battleships. Well, it was basically pure home defence, and it was acknowledged that they wouldn't stand a chance against a full-on seagoing capital ship. They would need to operate in packs, which is why you had things that had them designed in classes rather than as individual ships. And even then, they obviously weren't going to stand much against a full-on assault by a full-fledged navy. The basic role and mission of a coastal battleship was to be just enough of an annoying deterrent to hopefully get full-fledged coastal fleets to leave you alone on the basis that, yes, they could overwhelm you, but you'd make them just about pay enough of a price in doing so, especially in terms of cruisers and other things, that you'd leave yourself vulnerable to another large navy, so you wouldn't want to do that. And that had varying degrees of effectiveness, because as I've covered in some other videos, you have to do it right. You have to get the right balance so that you can have multiple ships on a relatively small budget, but have each one individually fierce enough that they are a legitimate threat that people get worried about. Life Beyond Living, who, as you might guess, is very frequent in the Discord chat, says, what would World War II have been like for the British Navy if they were granted permission to build 2 improved Admiral-class battle cruisers instead of the Nelsons? Honestly, this would have been a bit of a weird one, because the Hood vastly outdisplaces the Nelson but it's also a very different ship. I mean, even the improved Admiral class, they're still battle cruisers. I mean, yes, they're fast battleships as well, but you could, compared to a Nelson, they're very definitely battle cruisers. So weirdly enough, you'd end up with Hood as well, combining up to having three very large, very fast ships, but actually whose combat utility in terms of straight up gunfire is going to be, and protection is actually, they're going to be less useful than the Nelsons are. Their one advantage being speed, so they can keep charging around with carriers and as such. They'll probably get refits. Hood certainly at least will get a refit because it won't be strung along as the flagship of the fleet all the time. Um, but overall, unless Hood actually gets its what should have been its 1941 refit a lot earlier, which again it should have gotten well before then, um, having two improved Admiral class is probably actually going to be a lot less useful for the British than the Nelsons, because the Nelsons were cut down versions of the, as I said before, of the G3s and N3s combined, which applied a whole other generation's worth of learning to uh, naval ship design. So they were a lot tougher, a lot more heavily armed, a lot more heavily armoured. Yes, they were slower, but as a result, they could stand up to an awful lot more punishment, and did, which I rather doubt that the Hoods would have um, been able to do. So you would have the weird situation of having a much bigger, heavier displacement fleet, but probably a less combat capable one, all told, compared to what the Royal Navy actually got out of it. Would have been interesting to see what would have happened if they'd let them build two of the hulls as carriers, though. That would be quite the interesting thing to take into consideration. Luce asks, would the British have scrapped the Hood at the end of World War II if it had survived like so many of their other ships, or would the British public have seen this as too much and petitioned to save her? Well, they did scrap the Warspite, and the Warspite had far more battle honours than the Hood would ever have. Um, they scrapped Duke of York, and Duke of York sank the Scharnhorst. Um, to be honest, given the costs of preserving a ship, and given that Britain was pretty much flat broke at the in the late 1940s, I do find it very difficult to see them even saving the Hood, which would be a great pity. The only way I can see it happening would be if, by Hood surviving, Hood also managed to defeat the Bismarck at the Battle of the Denmark Strait. That might give it enough notoriety to start a public campaign or petition to get it saved. Whether or not that would succeed or not is another matter. But then again, you also have to consider whether or not that would be enough, because although we can look back in hindsight and say, oh yeah, well surely anything that sinks the Bismarck must be preserved. Well, King George V and Rodney sank the Bismarck and they weren't. But also a lot of the Bismarck's notoriety comes around specifically because it sank the Hood and then everyone went to hunt it down. If the Bismarck had just sailed into the Denmark Strait, faced off against Hood and Prince of Wales and got sunk, it would probably be a much more of a footnote in naval history than it is today. So overall, just with that change of events, I think the odds would be against Hood being preserved. Um, the only way, thinking it further, if you want to change the timeline still further, if Hood had managed to sink Bismarck but been damaged, then forced to be pulled in for a refit like it was due to, got fully refitted and modernised, sort of similar to Warspite and Queen Elizabeth, and then maybe gone on to further successes. I mean, if they're giving it like full radar suites and everything, then maybe it would have been out on the Arctic convoy duties instead of Duke of York, and maybe it would have sunk the Scharnhorst. Being a fairly fast ship, it would have definitely been sent out to the Pacific, I think. And so, with the ship in sort of near enough new condition, if it had managed to chalk up both Bismarck and Scharnhorst on its kill tally, and had a successful war record as well, then it might, given its somewhat similarities to the Vanguard, it might be kept in service just long enough to maybe reach the 1950s, when the British had a little bit more than 2 shillings and sixpence to rub together, and with that extra notoriety and a little bit more money, they might just have been a successful campaign to save it. But that relies on a fairly big departure from the original timeline, so take that as you will. A Life Beyond Living asks, if the UK had learned about the Bismarck's development around or just before King George V, etc. were laid down, and they'd have invoked the escalator clause, what would a modified King George V to take on Bismarck have looked like? Well, the escalator clause was invoked pretty quickly and pretty soon around the building of King George V, as I've covered in the video on the North Carolina. The North Carolina was designed pretty much along similar lines to King George V with quad 14s. It was just the few months later, which meant that when the escalator clauses were invoked, it was just about able to be pulled back and refitted with the triple 16s, whereas King George V and its successors hadn't. They were just too far along, so they had to go with what they had. In terms of if they'd learned about Bismarck a little bit earlier and how massively overweight it was, then the single biggest problem with reconfiguring the design is that all the King George V class were laid down in 1937, which doesn't really give you much room to change anything. But with King George V and Prince of Wales laid down earlier than the others, you might have seen Duke of York Anson and Howe suspended so that they could throw together what would probably be a version of the Lion class just earlier. They did have a 1938 design of the Lion, which obviously a year too late, but they were beginning to look at a 35,000-ton ship with 16-inch guns. So you might have seen either a move towards 3 triple 15-inch with the new and updated 15-inch they were thinking about earlier in the King George V design, or they might have just gone straight for the 16s and sort of had a proto-Lion type. So I think that's probably the most likely reaction. But then again, given that they were all being laid down in 1937, it may be that the British might just say, well, look, it's too late for that lot, and any kind of delay to them is going to be problematic, so let's just build those, and then maybe they bring the Lion design forward, because Lion and Temeraire obviously were laid down, but much later, so they might have just brought the Lion design forward and ordered Lion and Temeraire in 38, which, given that the British shipyards built battleships even in World War II quicker than the Germans, you might have just about seen at least HMS Lion get in service in time to engage Bismarck, which would have been a rather interesting fight, to say the least. Corporal Tommy mentions that in the Yamato guide video, I mentioned that Montana was built to what the Americans guessed the Japanese battleship's specs were. And he says, what do you think the Montana design would have been like if somehow the Americans had known what the actual specs of the Yamato were? Well, given that the US did have some prototype study 18-inch guns available, I'm sure someone would have asked them to consider rearming the Montana design with 18-inch guns, but I'm not necessarily sure they would have gone for it, because the revision to the design would have just meant more delays, and Yamato was already well ahead of the Montanas in terms of time in construction. I think what's more likely is they would have kept the main armament, because let's face it, 12 16-inch 50 caliber guns firing super heavy shells is still one hell of a broadside. The main thing would have been that Yamato's top speed is well in excess of the Montana's, and with its main armament combined, that's quite the significant threat. So I think probably what they would have done is they would have, kind of like how the Iowas in some respects, not all, but in some respects, were stretched South Dakotas to get them up to the necessary fast speed they needed. with the 16-inch 50s thrown on almost as an afterthought, you might well have seen them take the Montana design and stretch it out to facilitate more machinery to get it up to a speed that at least matches the Yamato. And given that if they've known that Yamato has 18-inch guns, they might well have stuck a few extra inches of armour onto the ships as well. So you might end up with effectively a fast Montana design, which would be quite interesting and fairly useful, I would imagine. The other possibility, of course, which I can see a lot of people reaching for their keyboards right now, is that given the armament, the armour, and the speed of the Yamato matching up, along with the displacement, matching up very closely with the later Tillman designs, I'm fairly sure there would have been some poor congressional archivist whose eyes would have lit up and he would have burst out of the dusty realms of the Congressional Library yelling, "My time has come!" waving the plans for the 1930s Tillman revisions around. And somebody somewhere would have been mad enough to try and pressure the US Navy into building a Tillman design. Maybe Tillman 4.2 reworked over with some more torpedo protection and a hell of a lot more anti-aircraft firepower. Well, you can always dream, can't you? And another question, were there any reasons outside of parts interchangeability to give King George V the 4-gun and 2-gun turrets up front rather than a pair of triples? And the short answer to that is yes. And it basically comes down to that right up until almost the last minute in the King George V class design, the King George V was designed to actually have 3 quadruple turrets for a total of 12 guns. They found out at the last minute that they couldn't quite manage this and stay within the 35,000 ton displacement limit set up by the treaty restrictions at the time. And, of course, being British, for some reason, they decided that, unlike the Germans, the Italians, etc., they weren't going to just lie about it, they were actually going to modify their design to try and comply with the treaty restrictions, and so they had to scratch build a twin turret, which dropped the displacement of the ships down substantially enough to get under the treaty limits. So, yeah, basically, the only reason that twin turret is there is because somebody in the British government decided they wanted to try and stick to the rules precisely, and otherwise it would have been just another quadruple 14. Okay, we'll round out this episode. I like this question. It gives me a chance to make a really really nice answer. Luce asks, why on God's earth did the British decide they needed a 112-gun first-rate ship of the line, the HMS St Lawrence on Lake Ontario, when most of the combat was between brigs and light frigates? What drove the English to go way over the top for what is essentially a literal ship of the line? Well, the Great Lakes combat of the War of 1812 through 1814 is a wonderful thing. I highly recommend that any of you who are listening who have an interest in naval combat have a good old read up on it. It is one of the most variable naval campaigns, and it's a wonderful example of two sides digging their heels in and going, if you can do it, I'm just going to do it better. So, in 1812, the naval forces, quote unquote, present on the Great Lakes between Canada and America, with a couple of minor exceptions, effectively added up to what were effectively a few glorified rowboats, a couple of what could arguably be classified as small sloops and brigs, which were barely any bigger, and the odd merchant ship that someone had shanghaied into service just because it was a bit bigger than the actual naval ships and you could stick a few guns on it. There they had some fighting, and it turned out that one side or the other would come out ahead, and the other side would retreat to lick its wounds, because in such a small combat environment, friendly ports were always relatively close, so you could always run away if you were losing. And the losing side would tend to go back and go, well, clearly the problem is our ships were smaller, dash less well armed, dash less numerous. We need to build replacements anyway, so while we're building replacements, we will build them bigger and better armed, so that when we come back, not only will we equal them in numbers, but we'll have more guns and more durability, and then they will lose, and then we will be the ones who are laughing. And because you could just, if you were the other side, just sort of sail over, have a mosey on, and look over and go, oh yeah, look what they're building. I can tell roughly what size that's going to be. I guess we should build our own, but why build a matching ship? We must build one that's even bigger, so that when they come, they will be surprised that we have sort of seen. It's kind of one of these scenarios of, you know that I know that you know that I know, but do you know that I know that you know that I know that you know that I know? See if you can follow that logic. So yeah, it's kind of like that, and so the fleets went very rapidly up through brigs and sloops and schooners and light frigates and full-on frigates and fifth, like you're getting full-on sixth-rate and fifth-rate ships, duking it out. As I said, with the fortunes of war going back and forth, both in general terms and on the specific lakes. And then once you got into the realm of actually having what were effectively full-on oceanic frigates having fights on the lakes, both sides kind of very cunningly slunk back to their respective harbours over the winter and went, well, we could build like a 50 or a 60 gun ship, but we now know after 2 years of war that they'll do the same thing. So why don't we just build an even bigger ship? But then there'll be a third rate. But then they'll build a third rate. But so we'll build a second. No, they'll build a second. Ah, right. No, we'll build the biggest ship we can. We'll build a first rate. And then, of course, the other side was like, we'll build a first rate as well. So there. And hence how in 2 years you escalated from like 6-gun sloops and brigs up to 100-gun plus ships of the line. Yeah. I mean, apart from the fact America was kind of going bankrupt, it would have been a bit hilarious if the war dragged on another year just to see a full-on ship of the line engagement slugging it out over the Great Lakes. That would have been great. Yeah, so yeah, that's basically how it all escalated. Neither side was in any way willing to surrender permanent control of the Great Lakes, and they were willing to do absolutely everything they could possibly get their hands on to do in order to attain that superiority. There was also a slight factor of, compared to the full-on oceanic navy areas, you didn't have the resources to build a lot of ships and to crew a lot of ships, so it was actually more cost effective to build a single larger vessel, because then your supplies would go a little bit further. So yeah, it's like a first-rate ship of the line, you might need several hundred people to crew it, but if you built, I don't know, 3/4 rates, you'd actually probably end up needing more people and more guns, and using more vital naval supplies for things like masts and rigging and such. And then the guy with the first rate will probably just beat the ever-living daylights out of you anyway, so might as well build the big first rate. So yeah, I enjoyed having to answer that question, as you might be able to tell. It's a fun little part of the War of 1812 that doesn't very often get told outside of little niche areas that people like to try trumpet over one way or the other, because Control did tend to swing back and forth on that one quite a bit. Anyway, that is that for today. That's that for this video. Thank you very much for listening. We're now in 2019, and I hope to see you all again for the next video. Thank you, and goodbye.